so good to be back. And it's so good to see the faces that I've been praying for. Since the beginning of this month, I asked Andrew, could you give me the list of all the names so that I can pray for them name by name? And there are certain names that I'm like, whoa, like, I wonder how he looks like. Like, for example, Jedediah. Who's Jedediah here? I was like, that's one of the favorite names in the Bible for me. So I'm like, dang, I really want to meet this guy. But Jedediah, as I was praying for you, what I felt was like, you know how the name Jedediah is like God's name for Solomon. But Solomon stood by his physical name that his parents gave. But I felt like for you, Jedediah, God is saying, Jedediah, you are my favorite. And I'm going to give you something that your parents couldn't have given you. And I assume that your parents are amazing because to name a kid Jedediah, it's like they need to know the Bible. But I feel like still God's saying, Jedediah, before you are your dad and your mom's son, you are my son. And I've called you. And I also feel like just like Isaiah, God has said, I have set you apart. I have set you apart for the nations. So dream big, and be proud of who you are in the Lord. Yeah, so there's other names, and I would love to share during my week that I'm here, but it's just so good to see all of you guys, and this is almost like for me a promised land. Because back in 2016, I stopped DBS, and I was actually, I did my DTS back in 2011, January, and from then on I was doing back-to-back. DTS, staffing DTS, and I went to England to do SBS. And then after SBS, I went around to just speak and just preach about the word of the Lord because I fell in love with the word. And then I did Titus. And then after Titus, I went to do DRBS, which is Directed Reading and Biblical Studies. It's 3 months of just reading dictionaries. And that's it. Dictionaries and commentaries for 3 months. And you just talk with your school leader about what you've learned. And then after that, I staffed SBS, and then I came back in 2014 to Awaken. That's when Terry and Andrew York was leading a DTS. And my heart was like, I am ready to move on. I'm ready to go to seminary. So this is my last DTS with YWAM, and I'm going to move. But that's when I met Andrew. I knew Terry back from 2011 because I staffed DTS with her. And I was like, man, whoever gets Terry, he must be an amazing guy. And then I met Andrew. And to be honest, in the beginning, I was like, who is this guy that took Terry? Like, it's like, I hope like he's cool enough. I hope he's worthy. Like, that was me. Because Terry's such a great sister and someone that I really honor and respect. And then I met Andrew. And I'm sure you guys are convinced too. He's an amazing leader. He's like a Jonathan to David. It's that kind of leader that we don't really see often in today's society. But he was that kind of leader. And I was like, Andrew, man, I'm going to commit. So I stayed in Kona till 2016. And then that's when I got burnt out. That's another side of the story. But that's when, just quick, brief reason why I got burnt out was because the Bible that was the reason that I was like so passionate about doing ministry, became a textbook, became a reason to do ministry. Like it no longer was a living, breathing word of the Lord, but it became a textbook, a source of ministry where I needed to raise supporters, to be honest. Like, oh, YMS, we know that, right? And so when that happened, my spirit began to slowly dry up. And then I realized by end of staffing DBS, I need a sabbatical. And that was when God just amazingly brought my husband into my life. And long story short, it's been like almost 2 years now that I'm back into ministry. So right now, for me, it's almost like Joshua moment. To be honest, you guys are like that promised land that God has been telling me, Lia, you are called to be a teacher. Lia, you're called to teach. And I really believe this week, God is going to stir and awaken and make you remember the dreams that you had when you were little, the dreams that you had before, and you soon forgot or you let go of it because you thought it was too immature, you thought that was just nonsense. But I feel like the Lord's going to bring you back to the moment where you had that dream in the beginning and say, hey, I'm going to bring you to the promised land. It's going to be fulfilled. Will you trust me? Would you hold my hand? Let's do this. So I am so excited to teach you guys the tribal week of Joshua, Judges, Ruth, and the Psalms. Yeah. So, I mean, I was so excited to see like Sim and Julie, but I guess
tomorrow.
Okay. So 2016 I staffed his DBS. It's a and thought I would just share some cool photos of him because put your hand up if you have Sim in your small group. Okay, I'm going to tell you this. He's an amazing pastoral leader with such a huge heart. He is amazing. And not only is he a nice guy, he's good at what he's doing. So you guys are in for a treat because he is very academic as well. So he's definitely going to take care of you guys really well. Okay. Oh, my Wi-Fi was...
예, 괜찮습니다.
Yeah. Okay. Why is it not working? 파프도 안 돼.
Johnny. Hi, I'm Johnny. let you all know.
Yeah, thank you so much for waiting. Oh, Sim, thank you. Okay. Yes. So this was my small group, and you see Sim. I don't know if you know Yona, but that's Yona. Yeah, we were intense group. Yes, this was our dress-up party for DBS. And out of all of us, Sim was the most accurate, biblically accurate, and you'll figure out why when you get into Song of Solomon. But he was very accurate with his dress-up. So he's amazing. He's funny. He's amazing. And yeah, and it was really this group. And this is what I love about DBS. The small group. It's like you just become good friends in your small group. And it's a place where you can be vulnerable. And this was a group that actually really helped me get through the last season of DBS that I struggled so far. And if it wasn't for this group, I don't think I could have finished well. So I'm so forever grateful for this group. I know Andrew introduced before, but I just want to share a testimony that related to the guy that Andrew introduced. When I was 10 years old, I said, God, I really want Jesus to be my first love. Like, literally, I really want that. So I'm going to fast having a boyfriend for the next 12 years. Like, I want to set my life aside and really focus on having you as my first love. And so when I was 10, I consecrated myself, dedicated 12 years of no dating. And okay, it was hard, when I get into high school. It was like, man, like God, like, oh. But in those moments, I was praying, God, I pray that you will bring a husband in my life that will be a godly man whom I can respect spiritually. God, I pray. And I began to pray for my husband since when I was 10. And then guess what? After 12 years, what happens? I go and do my DTS. It's like, dang, like I thought he will just come straight after 12 years, but I'm in DTS and no dating in DTS, guys, right? So I'm like, okay, I'm going to be a good student, no dating. And then what happens after DTS? I'm free, but I'm like, then I get into staffing. And so this is my first ever staffing opportunity. So, as a new staff, you want to give all in and just like, God, I dedicate the next 6 more months to just focus on you. And that extended. And then I did SBS. And then, so until 27 years, I didn't have a boyfriend. And deep inside, I slowly began to think, God, would you really answer this? Like, am I called to be single? And I had so much unbelief about marriage. And I left in 2016 single, but I came back today with a husband. And I just want to say, guys, whoever is single here, God is so faithful. Don't lose hope. Don't lose hope. Keep praying. Keep praying. So, yes, that's me and my husband in Chicago. We live in Chicago. And that's my family. So, I don't know if you know Praise. He's my brother. So, this is my side and this is Johnny's side. And all my members, my side, have done SBS. They've actually done BCC and SBS. And so I love it when we gather together for like dinner in our family, we talk about, so what do you think who wrote the book of Song of Songs? Like, do you think it was really Solomon? And we're like, no, I don't think it was Solomon, blah, blah, blah. And like, no, I don't think. And then my mom goes, hey, do you know that I can remember all the names of the kings in their chronological order? And then she goes through. So this is our conversation. But we love it. Like, I love it. My dad teaches Bible in DTS now, and it's just so fun having a family who loves the word. But this is my new family that I have in Chicago, and as a Korean, I don't know if Koreans here would know, but if your mom-in-law lives like 10 minutes from your house as a newlywed, like all my Korean friends who found that out, they told me, you're screwed. Like, Lia, you're screwed. Like, cause we just have this idea of like, daughter-in-law, mom-in-law, they go, like, it's like you fight. It's not like a good relationship. But I'm just so grateful for my in-laws, like the relationship that I have. She's praying for us every day. She's praying for you guys every day. And I love our sisters too. Such a huge support in my life. So another side of the story, yes, it can happen. And yes, your in-laws can be amazing. Even if they're Korean. And even if they live like 10 minutes away from you. Yes. They can be amazing. So keep praying. Don't lose hope. Okay. So that was my introduction. So Book of Joshua. I've given Andrew handouts. So for those that do like to go through the handouts. Oh, don't get sidetracked by the Facebook, but yes, use that. 여보, 이거 또 이렇게 됐어. I don't know why. Sorry. Thank you. So I asked Andrew, like, what is this group like? And he was saying, yeah, they're such a delight. I love them. And you know, it's one thing when a school leader says, oh, they're great, they're awesome. But it's another thing when a school leader says, hey, I actually love and enjoy the school. And so what I even heard from Leilani was like, I was asking her, Leilani, are they like academic group where they just love facts? Or are they more interactive? They like stories? And she's like, you know, they have like both. They do love stories, but they're very academic and they really want you to give them a lot of information. So I hope you guys are ready for a lot of information because Joshua is a very, it's a huge battleground right now among the scholars. There's so much debate about the book of Joshua. And so it's so important for us to go through it thoroughly. So promised land. We all have promised land. Whether you know it now or whether you don't know it, we all have a promised land. Hebrew 4 talks about how all of us as Christians, our promised land is in heaven. But another concept of promised land that we can see throughout the Bible is the kingdom of God. And we see that as Jesus came, he's like, my kingdom, my kingdom. And even in YWAM, we talk about let's bring God's kingdom on earth. And so we talk about the spheres of society. So promised land for us can also mean the spheres of society that you guys are all called to, like business, missions, family, but it can also mean a certain geographical location that you are called to. Maybe it's Africa, China, or maybe back home. But we all have a promised land. We all have a place where God has called us to be rooted and to take back the territory and bring God's kingdom. So maybe you guys can relate to this. For example, put your hand up if you just got out of DTS this year. Like you've just graduated DTS. Awesome. Keep your hand up if you went back home. Okay, great. So I feel like you guys will relate with this story. Like I see it almost like this story from Genesis to Joshua like this. Like you come to Kona or the orientation day and you're like bombarded with all these like amazing people that are, hey, like how is it going? Oh my gosh, you're like Rebecca. Oh, you're awesome. I've been praying for you. And you're like, I thought hippies don't exist now, but I guess I'm in a different world. And so it's like Genesis, you're in a whole new world, like a Garden of Eden. Everybody's so vulnerable. They're like, hey, I used to do this in the past, and now Jesus saved me. And you're like, wow, too much vulnerability. And then you go through the lecture phase, and then God meets you, and He gives you identity. He tells you who He is, and He tells you who you are. And you're like, whoa, like finally get why those hippies were not really hippies, but it's like really from the joy of the Lord. And you're like, yeah, you're among the group now. Front row, like jumping up and down, going crazy. And then you're like, oh God, you're awesome. But then it's like, just like Exodus comes and where God judges the idols of Egypt, He comes and reveals the idolatry in your heart and the bondage that you have. And you're like, oh my gosh, Jesus, I didn't know I was such a bad guy, you know? And then He's like, don't worry, I'm going to rescue you out. And He takes you out just like the Red Seas. He takes you out and delivers you and sets you free. And you're like, Jesus, you're amazing. But then guess what? You end up in outreach. Yeah, you guys are laughing because you know what I'm talking about. The wilderness. You were like, man, not everybody is Bryce Anderson. Not everybody can sing like him. And you're like, you have this worship leader who's like, nobody in your group actually had the talent and gift to lead worship. So finally, this guy who had this, like a childhood dream, who wanted to be a singer but couldn't make it because there was a reason why. And he's like, in faith, I feel like God's telling me to lead worship. And you realize, man, pray, Jesus, that you give him an anointing of tunes and rhythms. And, you know, and you realize this is carrying my cross daily as I go through this worship, believing that God, you're the same in Ohana Code and you're same on outreach with this guy. And you go through this and you experience amazing like provision from the Lord. And it's just like the wilderness. It's hard, it's tough, but it's good because you get to experience God. And then what? You graduate. And then it's like Israelites in front of the promised land. You're like, my friends, my family, they're the same. And you're there to try to influence and bring back the transformation and the revelation of who God is. And you're like, I don't think I can do this. I thought I could, but I don't think I could do this. And this is like the Israelites. They've experienced and seen the amazing miracles of the Lord. And they were like excited and pumped. But then promised land comes and they're faced with these giants and they're like, I don't think I can do this. And so that is why that we need to dig Joshua really well because it's so practical and applicable in our daily lives. So, who wrote Joshua? So I'm going to go through what my lecture normally goes through is a lot of like a third of it will be background information of the Bible. Like who wrote the book, arguments about who wrote the book, when they wrote the book, what kind of literature is the book. To be honest, during SBS, I really didn't enjoy those times. I was like, just tell me who wrote the book. I'll just go with it. I don't care if it's Samuel or this guy later in like, Ezra. I just want to stick with one and go. But then what I found out after SBS, in the world, people have so many questions about the Bible. Like we know that Christianity, we struggle with Bible illiterates. Only 10% know Bible back to back. But I assure you, a lot more would know the issues of the Bible. They'll be like, hey, did you know that actually the wall of Jericho didn't really crumble down by Joshua? Hey, did you know that the Israelites they didn't really conquer the promised land. They weren't really, God didn't really deliver them out of Egypt. They just escaped. And we have this huge history and this myth about Israel. And so in those moments, you can say, well, you're wrong. And they'll be like, well, prove it. And you can't. You just don't have the knowledge. Even for example, college students, they go through Sunday school. They hear about these Bible stories. And they're like, oh, God is awesome. He's a creator. And then they go to college. And then the professor tells them, hey, do you know that our DNA is 95% similar to the chickens? And they begin to think about evolution theory. They think about Big Bang. And then they think about, hey, actually maybe this Bible story is a myth. It's an Israelites myth. I mean, for Koreans, we have this myth of how we became to be is, so the myth of, we call it 당군 신화. And it's a story where a bear and a lion wanted to become a human. So they prayed to the God, and the God says, hey, if you eat garlic and this really bitter herbs for 100 days, I'll turn you into a human being. The tiger gives up, the bear cries and eats garlic all day, and she becomes a human. So that's how Korean came to be. So you might think that's so ridiculous. Who would believe that's true? Of course not. But then think about the Red Sea. God split the Red Sea so that this humongous group of Israelites walked on dry land. That's ridiculous. The walls of Jericho just crumbling down because this group decided to shout. Ah! And it just crumbles down like breadcrumbs. That's ridiculous. And so they will tell you that's no different to any other myth in the world. And in the midst of that, what will you say? Well, I believe. But what will you say? Hey, I actually know where you're coming from. Because I know that a scholar said this about this. But did you know that archaeology, actually they found this evidence that will back it up that Jericho actually did happen in the time of Joshua? And then you begin to realize that you become a witness of the existence of God and the truth of the Bible and the supernatural power in the Bible as you tell them about this information. So let's be Christians who are not naive. Let's be Christians who also know what the enemy is trying to confuse people in the world about the Word of God. So it's so important for us to know these background info. And in SBS, we call this BRI, standing for Basic Required Information. So if you're planning on doing SBS, you guys are in for a treat because, yeah, it's pretty much I'm giving you guys some of the answers. But this is what happens when you don't really know the background info. So I used to work at a urban fashion outlet store and worked in the headquarters with the digital marketing. And for Mother's Day, they asked me, could you find a good quote for Mother's Day? So I looked up the Mother's Day to get a good quote for a company, and this is what I found. As is the mother, so is her daughter. Happy Mother's Day! But I don't know if you know, this part in Ezekiel 16:44, you can read it later on, but it actually talks about the judgment of Israel and God saying, hey, you are a whore. You are acting like a whore. Your idolatrous action is a whore. And he was saying, and Judah, just like your mother, like the Canaanites, the Amorites, you are just like them. And he was basically telling them, you are a whore. So when you're saying Happy Mother's Day with this great quote, you're saying, I don't want to say it, but you are saying that. So it's so important. And I'm sure it would have been a Christian who looks through Ezekiel and finds a quote like that. So I think it's a Christian who doesn't really know the Bible background well, and it's posting it up, putting pink and pretty heart pictures around to encourage people like, Happy Mother's Day, Mom, I love you. Yeah, so don't do that, guys. So who are the Israelites? They are the second generation Israelites. So in Numbers, we see that God says, because of the unfaithfulness, everybody 20 years and over can't go into the promised land. So the second generation Israelites are actually also the people that were 19 years and younger. So what that means is that there are some people who have actually seen Egypt and the exodus of Egypt. So it's not just freshly born babies in the wilderness. which could be majority of them, but it also consists of people who are 19 years and younger. And also Caleb and Joshua. And who are the Israelites? What were they calling? Exodus 19:6 says they were called to be a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. God was telling Israel as a whole, you are supposed to be a priestly nation just like the Levites are to you. You are called to be holy and you're called to be mine. And why was that? Because the location of Israel that God has promised to give them was in a very significant place. So these lines actually talk about trade routes. These were the these were the roads that traders or businessmen would go. People would go to travel. In those times, you don't just because you want to go to Asia, you don't You don't just walk that way. You don't go through the desert because nobody survives in the desert. Same with this. If you want to sail, you go through the coastal islands and the lands because you get shipwrecked so often. And we see that in Paul's journey, so many times he's shipwrecked. So these sailors will go through the coast because if they get shipwrecked, they'll get help. They'll have emergency supplies. So this is how they travel. And as you can see, everything goes through Israel. In this ancient time, one of the most developed nations and empires in this time were actually Egypt. And Africa in that time was very fertile. It was a land where it was abundant. So many food, so many fertile land. They were also famous for their horses. So that's why a lot of people in these ancient times wanted to trade horses from Egypt because Egypt had the best horses. And now we have Asia. The Babylonians, the Persians, India. As we know, they're famous for their spices. They're famous for their oils, expensive oils and perfumes. And people wanted that, so they needed to trade with Asia. And then we have Europe. And they were known for their metals at that time. Gold, tin, silver. And that's why when we later find out in the book of Samuel, we see that the Philistines had this technology to make iron weapons that nobody had. And the Philistines are actually known to be from Europe. They were sea people from Europe. And so Europe had good metal that people wanted to get, and metal technology. And so as you can see, we all had to go across. And God has placed Israel in this place for a purpose. Because what happens when Israel fully obeys and God blesses them? If Israel just follows their law, what happens? What did you guys learn from last week? What did God promise to Israel? If you obey my laws, obey my covenant, this will happen. Huh? I'll make you priest. Yeah, that's their identity. Another thing, what did they promise? What did God promise? They'll be blessed. Awesome. Can you tell me in detail what? Yeah?
It's the fruit of the womb, be blessed, the crops.
Yes. Awesome. That's so important because fertility was one of the major factors of materialism. You make babies and they help you work, they help you, they take care of you, they supply for you. And so these are so important. Being fertile, having a lot of kids were so important back then. It was a message of wealth too. And so when Israel obeyed these laws, these nations will walk through the land of Israel and will notice hey, what? You don't offer babies to the god of Molech? And yet you still can live in prosperity? God still blesses you? That's amazing. Because back in the days, in order to be blessed in fertility and also materialistic, they offered their babies to this God alive in a burning fire. And so they're whoa, who is this Yahweh? Another thing is one of the things that I love, part that I love in God's law is in Deuteronomy, it talks about women. Taken in captive. So they go to war and they see a woman and they want to take her. And God tells them, hey, guys, if you see a beautiful woman that you just, battled and won and you see her there, don't just rape her. Don't just take her. Because back in the days, nations, they earned money through slave trade. They will fight, they'll defeat a country, and then they will go and grab women and children and they'll sell them to slavery. And that's how they get a lot of profit from them. But God was saying, hey, you guys don't do that. When you see a beautiful woman, other nations will probably go and take her, rape her, and throw her away. But I don't want you to do that. Bring her in, shave off her head, trim her nails, give her new clothes, and let her cry for her parents for a month. Leave her for a month. Then take her in. And I'm like, what? God, like, you tell her to shave her hair? Like, it's a woman. I'm like, no, that's not nice. But the reason why he was saying that was because back in Israel's culture, for a woman to grieve over the parent, they shave their heads in the sign of mourning. And then they cry and they wail for a whole month. And then God's saying, give this foreigner that you could totally treat her like slave, give her the equal rights as an Israelite woman and bring her in. Guys, like, isn't that amazing? Like, God was saying, I am different to the other gods that these people serve. And you should serve me differently. And you should live differently. And so imagine if these people cross and they're like, wow, the justice that you have in your society, the laws that you have in society. Wow, I want to believe in your God. And that was God's plan. And we see the glimpses of it in the Old Testament. For example, Queen of Sheba comes to Solomon. I heard amazing wise things about you. Can you teach me these? We also see in the names of, like, when you ever see names and genealogies, look for those names where God noticed he was an Edomite or he was a Hittite. Because those show that these foreigners left their country to live in Israel. They became Yahweh worshippers. And that was God's plan. Unfortunately, we don't really see that in the Old Testament because as you see from Judges, it goes really bad. And then David comes along and it goes really bad. And it goes really bad. So Israel don't really get to live out this destiny, this calling, until this happens. Okay. So, yes, fireworks to keep you guys awake. Yes. So back in Acts, we have the day of Pentecost, where the Holy Spirit comes upon the apostles, right? And they began to pray and speak in tongues. And when they began to speak in tongues, people that gathered to Jerusalem from different nations hears their language. From Rome, from different far away, from Asia, from Africa, and they hear their language. And they're like, these guys are Judeans and they're speaking in our language and they're talking about this Jesus. And Peter gives his first sermon to them. And in that day, 3,000 gets baptized. These group of people who were from different parts of the world came to Jerusalem to observe the Passover. And they get witnessed by Peter's message. And guess what happens? We read later on that they actually went back to these homes, back home. And they started house churches. How do we find out what a good evidence is in Rome? Paul goes to Rome, and he's one of the first apostles to go to Rome and finds out, well, there's already house churches here. Like, who started it? Not the disciples, not the apostles. It was way back in the day of Pentecost. They heard the message from Peter, that one sermon, and they went back home and began to have house churches and to share about Jesus. And so I want to encourage you guys. In our weaknesses, the promises of God is so big. It's so overwhelming. Especially during DTS, you might have heard so many like prophetic words over you, like you're going to go to the nations and you're like, yay, but then you rarely hit and like, I don't have $100 in my bank account. Like, how can I go? Like, God, you need to raise supporters in my life. I can't go, right? We have this overwhelming big promises of the Lord and we just can't see how it happens. But this is an amazing story and a testimony of God saying, I can do it. And even if you fail me, the God who started will finish what he has started. The God who has called you to DBS. And you might think by this week, man, academically, this is not the right school for me. Or, man, this is just going over my head. I don't know how much I'm getting discipleship. I don't know if I'm supposed to be here. Or like, this is not, I don't know, God. I think I need to pray about DBS again. Or the future after DBS. But God is saying, God who called you here will be faithful to finish what He has started. He's faithful over your lives more than you are. More than you are. I feel you have a hand up.
Just receiving it.
Okay. Yeah. Bless you, Ezra. Bless you. By the way, I love your name too. Yeah. Really, really powerful man of God in the Old Testament who changes and reforms the history of Israel. And he's one of the great leaders who comes back, brings people and brings them back to full devotion to the Lord. And it never really happened in the Old Testament until Ezra came along and brought the law of God back to the heart of Israel. But it just swung too much and they became very legalistic. But the passion that you carry for God, keep burning. I see this thing in you too, right now. I see that in you. Keep burning for God. Don't let people say you're too passionate, you're too loud, you're too energetic, you're too, whatever too. Keep burning for God. Because God is going to train you, He's going to mature you, and He's going to make you to the man that God has promised you to be. So keep going, Ezra. Canaanites. Now, who are the Canaanites? So often in the Bible we read about the Hittites, the Amorites, and the Bible will say, hey, the Amorites, kill the Amorites. They're all referring to one ethnic group. This big ethnic group called Canaanites. It's almost like, in China, we have so many ethnic groups in China, and we know them by Chinese, but actually they don't really speak Cantonese. They have different tribal languages. And so just like that, the Canaanites are generalized as the Canaanites, but in those Canaanites are the sub-ethnic group, like Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, that God has called them to be destroyed, like fully extinct. And you'd be like, man, like God is so cruel. But there's a reason for that. And I'll go through that deeper about why God ordered the whole ethnic cleanse of this place. But just another thing that I would talk about the Canaanites is that when you read Leviticus, you would read a lot about their sinful practices. And Leviticus says, don't do this like the nations that I'm going to destroy. So a lot of them is very awful, disgusting, like on top of my head, I can remember is like sex with animals, sex with your parents, using blood as a sacrifice. Like, I will get into more in the idolatry and the customs of Canaanites, but they were very sinful people. And it kind of makes sense because this is Canaan and this is Sodom and Gomorrah. So we all know how awful and evil Sodom and Gomorrah was, that God had to send fire because there was no righteous man. The angels went to Sodom and Gomorrah to check out if there was any righteous guy, and they found none. So Sodom and Gomorrah is here. So imagine how much the influence would have been between Canaan and Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay, then who is Joshua? I got this from a comic book. I don't think he really looked like that, but it's okay. If I get your attention and if I keep you alive, then it's cool. Joshua, there's not much known about Joshua. But we know that his grandfather was a very significant guy. We read that in back in like Numbers, where Moses gathers men, census for the men who can fight for battle, and he chooses one person in each tribe to be the head and the warrior. And guess what? It's Joshua's grandfather who's overseeing the 40,500 warriors of the tribe of Ephraim. So Joshua wasn't just like a normal guy; he kind of had a legacy going on. And he was also chosen as a representative of Ephraim to spy out the land. And his name, Hosea, his original name is Hosea, and it means he saves. But Moses changes his name to Joshua, which means Yahweh saves. And imagine, guys, if the Hebrews are saying, hey, the Israelites are looking at Joshua and say, Yahweh saves. Yahweh saves. What did God say? Yahweh saves. Lead us. Like, it was almost like intentional purpose for the Israelites. When they ever saw Joshua as their leader leading them into the promised land, they would see not Joshua, but they would see Yahweh who saves them. And in New Testament, in Greek, Joshua is actually Jesus. And so a lot of the scholars talk about how Joshua is like our New Testament Jesus representative, and Jesus vice versa. And he was one of the guys from the first generation that was given the right to enter the promised land because he wholeheartedly followed the Lord. He was assistant to Moses, and we read this in Exodus 33:11. It talks about how Moses was at the tent of meeting God, and then when he's done, he would leave. But Joshua would stay there. He would linger in his presence. So, not much is talked about Joshua, but we do know that he was a man who was willing to stay in the presence of God. And he was a man who wholeheartedly followed God. So it makes sense. When he was one of the spies who entered the promised land to spy out the first time, what he saw was the perspective of God. He saw giants, but he saw through those giants and saw God behind it all. And I think one of the solution and the reason why Joshua was that kind of a guy was because he was a man who lingered in the presence of God, who was willing to just stay, like waste his time in God's presence. Could we turn to the one next to you and share one thing that either you learned or God spoke to you during the first hour? No, that'll be too much. 1 hour, please. The last hour. So turn to your partners and I want you to share one thing. It can be in threes. Thank you, this group, being proactive. All right. Is that right, Chris? You remember this 2 days from now?
Yeah, you have to 2 days from now.
Okay. Okay, I will remember that.
Wednesday, you call me out and you see what I learned Monday.
Okay, alright. Okay. Awesome. So the word that I got for you guys as a group was the word giver. And I felt like everybody here are givers. And what that means is that what you guys will get in this DBS, you all are going to give it back to whoever you're going to meet, whatever opportunity that you have, you're all going to give it back. And that's the feeling that I got. And so for me, as I was preparing the lecture this week, I kind of prepared in the mind of I'm teaching to the teachers. And I'm teaching to people who are influencers. And so as you are sitting in this week, I also want you to learn not just for yourself, but also for others. Think about people back home. Think about your sisters, brothers, friends. Think about people that God has put around you. And think about, wow, how can I deliver God's heart to them? The book of Joshua, Judges, Ruth, and Psalms. So I just want to encourage you to have that mindset. And the fact that you're doing DBS, you are setting yourself up for a lot of knowledge and understanding of the word that most Christians back at home doesn't. One of my friends, she did her DTS, she did her DBS, and then she went back home to Chicago. And right now, she's serving not just in our church, but also at a local church, a Nepali church, and serving the Sunday school kids and teaching them about the Bible. And what happened was when she came back, people were like, hey, like, you did DBS, right? It's like, yeah. Hey, can we do like a women's Bible study? And she's not an education major. Like, she doesn't have a degree in education or teaching. And she's pretty young, but people just came up to her because they knew that the knowledge that she gained through DBS was just really different to what you can get at church. And so I really want to encourage you guys. This 3 months, you might think it's just 3 months, but it could be 3 years of worth of knowledge and information. So God will definitely use everybody here to give it back when you go home or when you leave DBS. So literature, we're going to talk about the literature style of the book of Joshua. So how many of you, when you write your journal, do you write every single detail of your day? Put your hand if you're one of those, because I have never seen one. We don't write every single detail of what happened. Like, I was walking by Banyan Tree and then I saw Terry York passing by and I went to go and grab coffee. Like, we don't talk about every single detail because a journal is written from a perspective of a highlight of the day or a special event that's meaningful to you, right? It's very personal. Same like that, the Bible is God's story. We all know that, right? So when we look into the literature, especially the historical literature, we might get confused because on top of your head, you might think history. Oh, they need to be accurate. They need to show details. The numbers should match. The dating should match. But you realize in the Old Testament, it's not like that. The Old Testament, Joshua is in the Western Bible, is under the genre called historical literature. And what that simply means is a history of the Old Testament from God's perspective. So God has inspired an author to write and record the certain events in the time of their history so that it can continue on as a legacy to us. So we need to understand this historical literature doesn't mean that every single detail had to be there. No, it's only the amount of things that are written is from the perspective of God. In Jewish Bible, the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, it's actually under the genre of prophets. Now, you know the book of Jeremiah, the book of Isaiah. The book of Joshua is actually part of that genre. And that's how Jewish people read this book. So it's a prophet, it's a prophetic literature. And what that means is that it's supposed to teach and instruct the Israelites the law and God's perspective. And you'll see throughout the prophets, like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the minor prophets, God keeps referring back to the covenant, the law, the Deuteronomy, and tells them, you haven't done this. You disobeyed me. And same with that, book of Joshua and Judges is part of this genre called historical literature and a prophetic Old Testament literature, which is written from a perspective of God to teach and to reflect the history of Israel in the perspective from the Deuteronomy law. So it will refer back a lot with the law. So any questions? Do you understand? It's not our Western history book. It's Old Testament historical literature. What I love to do when I teach a book, I love to talk about the flow of the book. Because often when we think about, let's say, Joshua, a lot of us will say, yeah, the Battle of Jericho. Yeah, the Promised Land. But actually, the book of Joshua isn't just the Battle of Jericho and the Promised Land. A lot of the chapters, 13 to 21, it talks about the inheritance, the Israelites settling in the Promised Land. So for me, I love to teach the structure of the book. So that when you go and talk about it, you're not just like, oh, Jericho, I remember, but you actually know what the book of Joshua is about. So you might think, man, I'm so bad at memorizing. I'm really bad at memorizing Bible verses. When I was at Sunday school, Lia, like, you just, skip past me. But I have a fun way of memorizing things. So I remember Joshua as PCIC. Okay. Joshua. We think about warfare, right? We think about battle. And the most warfare-related battle experience we all will probably have in our lives will be outreach. Outreach is a very typical warfare zone. So when you're on outreach, as a school outreach leader, everyone, no matter how spiritual they are, no matter if there's in Africa, China, Europe, they look for one thing. Guess what it is? Wi-Fi. Got it. Yeah, they look for Wi-Fi. They look for this places like PC room. Like in Korea, we call it PC bang. We call it internet cafe. That's the first thing they're going to look for. Yeah, prayer, worship, awesome. That's all good. But they're going to look for Wi-Fi connection because that's like their life source. They need Wi-Fi to connect back to their school leader and tell them it's going so bad. I need your prayers. No, maybe not, but they need Wi-Fi. And so they're going to look for PC rooms, PC cafe. And so how I think about Joshua is outreach. And I think about PC. And it's like, outreach leader. Oh, PC, I see it. So PC, I see. Internet, outreach, PC, I see. Got it? Yeah? Not really. Maybe you're not too Asian like me to really think about internet as like a life source. I don't know. But this is how I remember Joshua. PCIC. Preparation, conquest, inheritance, and commitment. Joshua is it's divided into 4. And the first part talks about preparation. They don't just jump into the promised land. No, God prepares them. And then they have a conquest. And you think, oh, that's it. Joshua's done. No. Half of the book is actually about the inheritance and how and who settled in where. And then the last part talks about recommitment. They remake their covenant with God, and Joshua calls them to say, me and my house will serve Yahweh if you guys don't, but, who's with me? And everybody's like, we commit. So that's how it ends. So PCIC. Everybody repeat. PCIC. Because internet's so important on outreach, and it's Joshua. So preparation, conquest, inheritance, commitment. And now we're gonna... Oh yeah, this is it's one of the key verse. If you do SBS, they ask you to find the key verse that summarizes the whole book. This is one of the key verses, guys. You can read it in your PDF file later. Okay. So, Joshua, the overall of what God is doing through Joshua. We have to connect Joshua with a bigger picture of what God has been doing to understand what God is doing in Joshua and why is it so significant. And you see, in Genesis, God makes a covenant with Abraham saying, through you I'll bless others. And it's actually a redemption covenant of Jesus Christ. And then in Exodus, Egypt was a safe incubator for the sons of Abraham to actually grow as a nation, because the Egyptians didn't really wanted to mingle with Israelites, and Egypt was very fertile. And so God actually did bring them to Egypt to be in an incubator where they can grow as a nation. And then God was like, I still remember the covenant that I had with Abraham, and I'm going to take you out. And so they'll get into the book of the laws, the Numbers, the Deuteronomy, Leviticus, and it's there where God makes a covenant, not to one person now, but to a whole entire nation. And that's when Israel makes a covenant with God. And then we go to Joshua. And this is when God shows himself faithful to his covenant. Even in this challenge, he's like, hey guys, I can totally do this. And this is God showing his faithfulness in his covenant. And then later on, we'll go into Judges and you'll realize the people who disobeys the covenant and what it looks like. And then in Ruth, you'll look into and see, but there are still remnants, few people who actually lives by the covenant and how God blesses them. And then we get into Samuel and God talks about the kings after his own heart and who will obey his covenant. And we go through Saul and David and God compares them and say, man after my own heart, David who has kept my covenant. And so in Kings, we see God giving them Davidic covenant, saying, David, through you, I will bring Messiah. And he gives them a redemption covenant to David. And throughout the history of Israel till the exile, all the kings after David are referred to and measured by, did they obey the covenant by David, like David? did he follow the ways of David or did he not follow the ways of David? So we see the whole line of covenant in the Old Testament. And that's why the word covenant is so important. And that's why book of Joshua is so important, because it's the birthplace of God fulfilling the promises in real life. Okay. Did Debbie go with you about the dating of Exodus? Yeah? Oh, yeah, but why is this like doing this all the time when I shut it? I don't understand.
I'm pressing the wrong button.
I'm doing play and rehearse. Just play? Okay. Thank you. So, let's take a step back from the history actual events and let's look at when was this book written. Obviously, because it happened right after Exodus, so dating of Exodus is very important. And when I look at you guys, you're like, man, I'm not interested in talking about numbers right now. But I'll just go through really briefly. Like, in Kings, it talks about when Solomon's reign happened. And so by minusing that reign of 480 years intervened since the reign of Solomon, we kind of get a rough date of when Exodus happened. Okay, again, Kings talk about Solomon reign in this year, like certain 966 BC, and it talks about how from the time of Exodus to Solomon's reign, 480 years passed. So what do you do as a good student? You minus 480 years from that time, right? And then you get into 1446 BC. So that's how scholars date the time of Exodus. So the date you put Exodus really influences the date of Joshua, because there are mainstream scholars who will say, no, Exodus didn't happen in 1400, it happened in 1200, and we might be like, hey guys, it's only 200 years different, what's the matter? But it's a huge difference because the archaeology, it was totally different in the time of history. But there are scholars, and a lot of the mainstream scholars who actually say the 480 years is a symbolic number, not a literal number. That's what a lot of the ancient people did with numbers, was that it was very symbolic too, not just literally. And so they were saying, hey, it's symbolic, so it's not actually 480 years, but it happened like symbolically. And so the time of Exodus happened in 1200 BC. And there are certain times of history that actually make sense. A lot of archaeology in the area of Israel, they found a lot of destructions around the area of Canaan that dated back in 1200 BC. So they're like, hey, this gives evidence for that dating. Right after Exodus and then Joshua fighting the Canaanites, it gives a reason why these walls are broken down. But then the evangelical scholars, more the traditional side, they go with literal and say, no, it's 1400 BC. And God only told Israelites to burn down 3 cities. Other cities, they could have them as a home. And it's only these cities that were actually burned down, not everywhere in Canaan. So this excavation is not right. And then also the argument is that, hey, we actually found the Jericho, the wall collapse dating around 1400. So it must be this time. And also in the book of Joshua, it talks about Sidon the Great. But by this time, Sidon wasn't great. It was kind of like defeated. So if Joshua was referring to Sidon the Great, then it would have been during this time when actually Sidon was really great. So that was one of their evidences for this dating. Okay, so when and who wrote Joshua? Well, a lot of Jewish scholars will say, hey, it's actually Joshua who wrote, and Phineas, the high priest, edited later on. But there are studies about the literature of Joshua and say, hey, it doesn't make sense. Like, if Joshua wrote the book of Joshua, then how can he write the fact that he died in the age of 110 and was buried in this site? Like, if he wrote the book of Joshua, like how could he write that? And so there's also a lot of debates. But in the book of Joshua, there are evidences that Joshua did write a lot of it because of events that happened only that he would know, such as meeting the angel, the commander of the Lord's army. Yeah, so many different theories. You might be like, nah, but it's so important because even Christians, we have a lot of view about this and we do believe in certain things. So it's really important that we are aware that what other people believe and also respect what they believe too in terms of, hey, you think Joshua didn't write it? That's okay. We don't have to fight about this. So there's scholars who think the Deuteronomistic history view, which is saying Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers were by one author. And later, Deuteronomy, it wasn't written by Moses. It was written later at the end by someone who wanted to give authority with their book. So they said Moses wrote it and wrote Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and the Kings. Because they see so many connections here than this being connected there. So they have this Tetrachute and Deuteronomistic history opinion. But one thing that I'm kind of against this is that to have Deuteronomy not written by Moses and it's stuff, I can't take it. It's not where I stand. And also the fact that the Tetrachute, then it will be just 4 books of the Bible in the Old Testament as a law. It just feels like it's not finished. Like you finish with Numbers, where God just decides not to send people to the promised land. Like it's a very depressing ending and it ends from there. So I don't really believe in this side, but there are people who are really academic and they believe in this view. And then there's like the Hexaptitude. We come up with so many names, but actually it's one author who wrote the entire Genesis to Joshua because there's so many connections to it. But I would say evangelical scholars, we tend to believe Pentateuch and then Joshua, Judges being part of the historical literature. So Joshua, truth or fiction? Now you might be like, okay, why? But a lot of people out there do believe that Joshua was a myth. It was actually a myth that Israelites created to give itself an identity. And we have professors who are teaching the Old Testament who's atheists because they take Old Testament history really like a history book, a myth like other cultures. And they teach this, saying like, the Israelites, they really didn't come and attack Canaan. They were simply like peaceful pastoral nomads herding, and then slowly they came to Canaan and they got multiplied, had many babies, and then they just outgrown the Canaan population. They took over Canaan. That's what they think, and a lot of people do believe this. Another view is the revolt theory. The Israelites, the Canaanites, it's not really an attack from outside. It actually happened within the inside, the Canaan government. The lower class and the slaves of Canaanites just finally got fed up and said, hey, we want to revolt, we want to attack you guys, and then decide to create a revolution. And then suddenly they meet up with slaves that ran away from Egypt and say, hey, who are you? Oh, I am a worshiper of Yahweh. We just escaped Egypt. Hey, do you want to join us? Okay. So that's what they believe. The inside revolt. So it was actually the Canaanites that actually destroyed the Canaanites. But nowhere in the Bible talks about the destruction of the inward Canaanites destroying each other, because we believe in the conquest theory, right? That actually God did bring them into Canaan and He fought for them. And so the third theory is the conquest theory that a lot of us do believe in, is that God destroyed Canaan with Israel. And Israel did exodus out of Egypt. They weren't runaway slaves that sneaked out. They were actually a nation that God brought them out of Egypt. So this is what I found in Wikipedia. I mean, I know anybody can write on Wikipedia, but I thought this was very interesting because, like, if you're a parent and you have a kid, like, You imagine your kids searching up, was the Battle of Jericho really real? And then they will read this, and they're like, oh, actually, this guy who sounds so smart, it's like in the narrative of the conquest of Canaan, the book, like it's so smart, and he's talking about that it wasn't. It's like the excavations at Tal es Sultan, the biblical, all these like, nerdy academic words, and it's telling that the Battle of Jericho was fake. And in this page, what they state is this. Most scholars agree that the book of Joshua holds little of historical value. Most scholars really, I don't know how he got that, but that's what he says. And then the story of Jericho and the conquest generally probably represents the nationalist propaganda of the kings of Judah and their claims to the territory of the kingdom of Israel. So Joshua was written during the time of kings so that they can justify, hey, this is not Canaanites' land, this is our land. So they rewrote the history of Joshua. So this is what a lot of people who are not Christians actually do believe. And so we have to fight for this. When we read and learn about these details, the boring stuff that you guys really don't like and I actually don't really like, it actually is a battleground, and we need to be aware because we have to also inform them too. Yes.
What's the
Can I also have, is this connected to sound? So can I just play?
Great question. I don't know if we're
Okay.
I think so.
Maybe I'll just go back.
What's the significance between like it being real or not? Like, what does it being real?
Good.
How much does that matter?
Right.
I guess?
Really good question, because this is also a view that Christians have too. So it's not really about the faith, but for me personally, what I think, it's so important that this was real because we get to believe that God is a God who does miracles. He's a God who can do the impossible. He's a God who can totally do creative things. Like, who imagined that God will give a strategy to these Israelites in fighting against Canaan in the city of Jericho by going around, like, walk around the walls, like, every day for the 6 days, and on the 7th day, do it 7 times and blow the trumpet. That's so creative. Yet, who does that? But God wants to leave that because God is a creative God. And He also wants to really, I think, wants to just tell us that He is a God who we can't put into a box. And that question reminds me of the argument of Isaiah, actually, the authorship of Isaiah. There's people who believe that Isaiah wasn't written by one person, but more than 2 Isaiahs that wrote the book, because they're saying, how can the prophecy be so accurate? The name King Cyrus is mentioned. Like, who can actually accurately prophesy the name of a king that will happen many, many years later? Like, that's impossible. And so that's one of the reasons they're like, because they don't believe in prophecy. But it's so important that we have these books as our inheritance. It's something that actually did happen because this is our legacy too. And I'm sure people here have experienced something like this in your lives. When God did a Jericho moment in your life. When God brought you to promised land. When God finally fulfilled the dreams and the promises that you've been waiting for. So it's so important, I think. Did that answer? Yeah. Thank you for that question though. Okay. I hope it works. Oh. I hear the sound from here.
I can like hear it. I don't know how to turn the volume up. I wish we had a controller for this.
Turn the volume up on the TV.
Nice.
Did it work?
The fall of Jericho is the moment when the Israelites first took God's promised land. But But for many, this story is simply too extraordinary. It may even be a complete fiction.
Jericho really begins to put doubt in people's minds as to whether this biblical narrative hangs together historically as it is told.
And yet for others, the Bible's version of events is based on a kernel of truth.
Stories in the Bible don't come from nowhere. They're picking up real folk traditions, weaving them together into a story in the dim and distant past.
And for one man, the archaeological evidence matches the biblical account word for word.
In my mind, it certainly shows not only the accuracy, but an eyewitness account.
For archaeologist Bryant Wood, scattered among the ancient ruins of Jericho is evidence that backs up one of the most incredible stories in the Bible. The fall of Jericho.
So Dr. Bryant Wood, so this is a guy that we saw who just showed himself at the end. There's a huge debate about the archaeology of Jericho because back in, I think like way back, Captain Kenyon, an archaeologist, excavated Jericho and actually said, hey, I don't find evidence that shows that actually people did came and settle on the land. I don't see any evidence of the walls crumbled down. So what she stated, Jericho is not true. It's just fiction and it's not true. And she actually found that the walls of Jericho was destroyed way back a couple of hundred years earlier than the stated 1400 BC. And she's saying Christianity got it wrong, Jericho didn't happen. But later on, Bryant Wood came and excavated and found in a different place that actually the double walls of Jericho had crumbled down. And they actually found evidence that showed, no, it was dated back in 1400, not 1500. And so we need to know that a lot of archaeologists will say, no, it didn't happen. But actually, a lot right now has found that the Bibles, the miracles, has actually did happen. And it's actually true. A lot of times, Bible gives evidence of the historical evidence that we don't really know in history. For example, the Hittite Empire. The historians didn't really know that the Hittite Empire did exist, apart from the Bible, because it talked about it. But later on, they find this archaeology in Turkey documenting that there's actually an empire called the Hittites. And so they were like, actually the Bible got it right. Another thing was the book of Daniel, and it talks about a ruler called Belshazzar. And they were saying there's no king called Belshazzar in the history of Assyria, like Babylonia. So Bible had it wrong. But later they find out, later on, that actually the king at that time was Nabonidus, but he had a son, and because his empire was so big, he decides to delegate half of his kingdom to his son. And so that's why Daniel was saying King Belshazzar. Yeah. And so we find often it's the Bible who actually says or mentions people in history that the historians didn't know. And so we have to be aware. Yes, the archaeologists and their evidence might sound scary, but also there are so many evidences that does show that the things in the Bible did happen. And it's like that example, like just because I can't prove that a spider exists in this room, doesn't mean that a spider isn't in this room. I'm sure there is a spider somewhere, or at least a gecko. But I don't have time to catch a gecko right now, but I can't show and prove to you. Somewhere on the ground? Oh, you got him? Okay. Yeah. It's done. But just like that, just because we cannot prove a Bible story in a real life doesn't mean it never happened. And another thing is the challenges in archaeology. So just want to show a diagram. So what happens is back in ancient times, let's say a nation goes and attacks a city and they die, destroy. And what they do is they don't clear it up. They cover it with dirt and build and resettle on top of this. And guess what happens later on? Nation comes and attacks, they destroy the city, cover it with dirt, builds another city. Same again, over the history. And so in Israel, you will notice a lot of hills. It's actually like built over time. This is how they resettled. And so what archaeologists do is when they excavate, they take a piece, bird's eye view, it looks like this. And they section it. And then a person will go and choose a section, and it will dig deep, layer after layer. And each layer, they collect evidence, like pottery, stones, bones, and they will use technology to find out when this happened. So the problem with excavation is that there's a huge time gap. Like, so many thousands of histories has passed, so you cannot be fully accurate. Another thing is you're limited because right now, people do live on this land. It's not like it's isolated. There are new settlements. And so you just cannot say, clear it up, guys, like move, you're going to excavate. It's excavate, but am I saying it right? Excavate, thank you. Excavate, because people are already settled. And also the method of archaeology is very complicated because you cannot make a mistake. You dig up, that's it. You can't say, oh, I made a mistake in the last one. No, it's done. So you cannot make mistakes. It's always on the first try, and it always comes from the interpretation of the person who excavated it. So if that person thinks, oh, it didn't happen, then they will find evidence to prove that it didn't happen. So these are the limitations of archaeology and excavation. And yes.
So there's at least 5 different places in the New Testament where either Joshua or Rahab are referred to.
Mm-hmm.
And if you end up with the theory that Joshua is just a made-up story, then you have to get rid of all 5 of those other books too.
Yeah.
And that is the ultimate goal of those who don't really believe the Bible.
Yeah, that's true. And that's another view of proving that it actually did happen. Because there is a New Testament, and you read mentions about Joshua and Rahab. So right now it's 11, so we're going to take a break. Right. Let's see what was happening in the Promised Land when the Israelites were going to conquer. So, Canaan, the empire of Hittites, we have a small empire here called the Mitannis, and they actually disappear because of this constant attack and battle with the Hittites. And then here down we have Egypt. And during 1400 BC, it was time when Egypt actually was strong, and so they kind of looked over, or they were like the governing kingdom over Canaanites. And the Canaanites operated in a political system called the city-states, which means every king in a city took charge or was, I would say, had authority over the towns and the little cities, little towns around it. So it was a city-state. So that's why we have so many kings when we read the book of Joshua. It's because Canaan didn't have one ruler. It had multiple rulers over cities. And what happens was that Egypt will ask the Canaanites for food, materials, because a vassal nation had to do that to a suzerain nation. And the Canaanites, the princes, will go to Egypt and will be educated and trained in Egypt. And the princesses of Canaan will go to Egypt and be part of the royal courts. And so there was a lot of interaction between Egypt and Canaan. And 1400 BC was a time when Canaan actually really was prosperous, and it was a land flowing with milk and honey. They were very rich. Trades were going so well, and it was a really wealthy place at the time the Israelites came to attack. So we have the Egyptians and their armies, the Hittites. They're the Indo-European ethnic group. And then we have the Babylonian Assyrians in Asia. And so this was the big kingdom, power nations that was there in the time of Israel occupying the Promised Land. And then the little Mitanni Empire disappears by 1200 BC. So, when you think about Israelites entering into Canaan and knowing that there wasn't any kind of interruption from the Egyptians, we all know why, right? Because they just defeated Egypt. Egypt wasn't in a place to help the Canaanites. But the Israelites didn't really have the perspective. And so this is what the Israelites thought. It's like, oh no, like they forgot. God saw everything, the political system, how Canaanites were actually a subordinate nation to Egypt, and but the Israelites didn't see it. What they saw, it was like, we can't go against them. They're stronger than we are. They will devour anyone who goes to live there. All the people we saw were huge. We even saw giants there, and the descendant of Anak. Next to them, we felt like grasshoppers. And this is funny. And they said, and that's what they thought too. They thought we were grasshoppers too. They were so afraid. But guess what? The reality though, in Canaan, as a vassal nation to Egypt, they were terrified of Israel. We see a glimpse of that through the confession of Rahab. But they were afraid of what God has done in Egypt. Remember, they were less powerful than Egypt. Egypt was the more powerful nation, empire that took them and was governing them. And so for them, these groups of Israelites who just came out of Egypt with conquering the idols and the kings, and they were terrified. They were so scared. And Rahab says, our hearts are melted. Everybody heard how God delivered you through the Red Sea. No wonder our hearts have melted in fear. No one has the courage to fight after hearing such things. For the Lord your God is the supreme God of the heavens above the earth below. And this is her confession. And this is her representative of what other Canaanites thought. They were terrified of Israel. And in 1 John 4:4, talks about how God's Spirit is in us. And the one who's in us is greater than the one who's of the world. But how many times are we kind of like the Israelites? We're like, man, this is so scary. Man, I can't do this. But in reality, the enemy, the devil, is more afraid of us. And often we see that strategy where the enemy will bring the greatest fear in the areas that you're called to, because when you walk it out in that calling and who you are, it terrifies the enemy. When you walk out the fullness of who you are in God, it terrifies him. And so he's going to do everything to make you sit down and believe that you are little grasshoppers. But the reality is this: they are so afraid of us. They are so scared. And I don't know what you would consider your own weaknesses. Maybe it's your education degree. Maybe it's your ability to speak, your confidence. I don't know. But I'm going to tell you, nothing is too weak for God who is in you, because he is the greatest, the mightiest God who can overcome anything. And this God is in you. The God you witnessed in Genesis, he's in you. The God you witnessed in Exodus, he's in you. And that itself is enough. So the enemy will try everything to fool you and to believe that you are grasshoppers. For me, teaching is my calling, but teaching is one of the most terrifying things. Actually, every time I prep, it terrifies me. I'm an over-preparer because I'm just so afraid that I don't know stuff when I teach. So I'll have 3 commentaries per book to study, read. And I'm like, God, I need to know everything. God needs to know this. And that was when God said, Lia, you are my messenger. Don't be afraid of them. Don't be terrified of them. To be honest, I was terrified of you guys. I didn't know who you guys were, but you guys were I'm not saying you are Canaanites, but for me, it was these giants I'm going to go and battle. These faces that I don't know. I'm an Asian girl speaking, second language to them, and I can't even pronounce Belshazzar. But, I was so terrified. But God had to remind me over and over, Lia, I have called you to teach. Lia, this is where you will shine because it's in your weakness that I can come through. And guess what? If you guys know me enough, like you will know that I'm not a type of person to come up and, joke around. I am a very introverted, serious person. Yet the fact that I can stand in front of you guys is because of the one who is in me, who is greater than the one who is of the world. And it's same with you guys. That is why Promised Land is so important because no matter who you are, in your capacity, God will give you the Promised Land and He will fight with you and for you. The enemy will do everything it can to terrify you. But in reality, the enemy is terrified and horrified by you. So now we're going to get into the one of the biggest issues of Joshua, which is the destroying the ethnic group of Canaan. And this can be sensitive. This might, disturb some people. But I want to first ask you to let the Bible speak for itself. I think often we come to a Bible school thinking, I know God, and He needs to be a God of mercy and love. And through our experience, we have this doctrine. But I think we all have some kind of heresy inside. Like, nobody's perfect. And so when we do read the Bible, we kind of have to let it inductively teach us. And so with this, I encourage you to let your heart be open and to really allow the Bible to speak for itself. So why destroying the Canaanites, the whole ethnic group? One of the reasons is that God is holy and He is just. In Deuteronomy 20, 16 to 18, could I have Ezra? Could you read out, can you see it, Deuteronomy? Could you read that scripture for us?
In those towns that the Lord your God is giving you as a special possession, destroy every living thing. You must completely destroy the Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, just as the Lord your God has commanded you. This will prevent the people of the land from teaching you to imitate their detestable customs in the worship of their gods, which would cause you to sin deeply against the Lord your God.
Thank you. This is the same God who is loving, who sent Jesus to die for our sins. And yet, He says, Joshua, I want you to go and destroy them. Israelites, go and destroy them. Because He is a just and holy God. We see not in this story, but we also see before in Genesis 2, where God says, I will destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. Sodom and Gomorrah because of their wickedness. I've waited, and now they've reached their judgment. The sin has reached its fullness. We also see it in the flood story where God says, hey, Noah, I'm going to just destroy the entire world and start all over again with you. Because if I let this go, they're going to continue and the sin's going to continue, build, and eventually they're going to destroy each other. So we have seen this before. And it's interesting, though, in the future from this event, in the time of Jonah goes to Nineveh because God tells him, go and share the message of repentance. Otherwise, I'm going to judge them. I'm going to destroy their city. But Nineveh, the king, everybody, including the animals, they fasted and repented. And their action actually made God say, hey, I'm not going to do that. So I want you to know that everybody had a chance in the time of history. And everybody was given a time of mercy from the Lord. And you might think like, how did the Canaanites, how did they get witnesses? They weren't like missionaries that went to Canaan to, talk about God. But actually, they were witnesses in Canaan. Abraham, who was a godly man, lived among the Canaanites. And he had interactions with kings. So they knew that Yahweh existed, and they knew just how good Yahweh was to his life. There were times where they could have been convinced, wow, your God is true and your ways are righteous. Another big thing is Melchizedek, king of Salem, which is Jerusalem. He was a high priest. It's like representation of Jesus Christ in the New Testament. And he was in Jerusalem, king of a city in Canaan at this time. Imagine, guys, if your king is like almost like God says, like he's a king and he's like Jesus Christ, like how holy and righteous will he be? And Jerusalem had that kind of king. And I'm sure in that city at the time worshipped Yahweh. And so there were so many opportunities where God was interacting with them, talking about them, and sharing who he was. And in New Testament, we read from Paul that even the Gentiles in their time actually had witnesses about who Christ was through the creation. Like creation testifies the glory and the presence of God. So everybody had the opportunity to be witnessed by God. And so I want to encourage you that actually the Canaanites, in some sense or the other, they had the opportunity to repent. And those that did repent, just like Rahab, God brought them in. We see Gibeonites, which is a small town in Canaan. They hear the story and they want to live. So what they do, they trick Joshua thinking they're not Canaanites and they make a treaty with them. And after that they find out, but God says, honor their treaty. Honor it. And so we see that God was still merciful to the few people who were willing to risk their lives to go all the way so that they can be part of Israel. So it wasn't like God's like, no, Rahab, you're still a prostitute. You're still a member of Canaan. You can't do that. No, God also had his doors open for them in some way or the other. And even throughout history too. So one of the big things about the reason for destroying, judging Canaanites was their idolatry and their sins. And it's funny because archaeologists have found as whenever they excavated the inhabitants of Canaanites, they found these two things. They were so common. Everywhere they went, they found these two evidences, and which were child sacrifice. Everywhere they went, they found, this is a Canaanite site, they found a sacrificial system of giving up their children to the worship of these idols. And it's not like, like kill them baby and sacrifice. It wasn't. The way they sacrificed was very just terrifying. What they had was a huge bronze statue, and it looked like this. And the hands had chains tied to the back. So the people would pull the chains, and the hands would go up like this. So they had this huge bronze statue, and they'll heat it up with fire so hot that the entire statue would go glowing red. And what they do is they will bring up their infant babies live, and they'll bring it up on their hand, on the hand of the statue. And as the baby, burns with that heat and cries out, it was a beautiful worship to them. And as they pull the chains, these hands will go up like this, and the baby will go into the hole in the mouth of the idol, go into the furnace. So it's really cruel. One, they wait till the baby actually feel the pain and not necessarily kill it straight away, and then they put it inside and put it into the furnace. And this wasn't forced. Parents did that with their own kids. Why? So that they can ask the gods to really bless them materialistically. That was one of the ways, and God detested it. He hated that. Another cultic practices, the second one that was very common, was idolatry related with sex. Sex and prostitutes and worship was such a huge part of culture of worship, where it's okay if your husband goes and has sex with a prostitute because it was part of worship, and he was hoping that the gods will bless them with fertility. And as a wife, you are used to sending your husband off. You go and have sex with a prostitute because it's a beautiful sacrifice, it's a worship. This was a mindset. And not only that, temple prostitutes, but sex with animals, I don't want to talk about all these stuff, but it's so just awful. And these are the common things that they practiced among the inhabitants of Canaan. And it's so funny that archaeologists also backs it up. It's like, hey, I found these two things again. Oh, it's Canaanites. But God waited for them. He tells Abraham in Genesis 15, he's like, Abraham, this is your promise and I'm going to give it to you. But the sins of the Amorites, the Canaanites, hasn't reached its fullness. I'm going to wait. Even while they were practicing these sins, God was saying, Abraham, I'm still going to wait for them. I'm still going to wait so that they can repent and come back to me. I still have hope in them. And so God waited. God waited for them, even though he saw his image. These children are all image carriers of God, being burned alive as a worship sacrifice. God waited. Another thing that's funny is that some did admit that, oh, this is just. We see that in Judges. In Judges 1, we have Adonai Bezek. He's a lord, a king of a city. And Israel goes and defeats him, and he simply says, oh, I did this to other kings. So this is fair. The Lord is paying back for what I've done. So, I mean, if a person is like that, your enemy is saying, hey, actually what you're doing to me is actually fair, you would understand, like, yeah, they were very sinful. They were very awful. So any questions, though, so far about this? Like, do you understand? Do you understand why God had to judge them? Do you understand that God waited for them? Your eyes. Oh, yeah?
I don't have a question. Just want to bring a little bit of clarification. It wasn't just certain people of the Canaanite culture who participated in this. It was the Canaanite culture as a whole. So it wasn't like you had some innocent people that were just caught up and they were killed because God said so. Like, that entire land and culture were wholly devoted to evil and idolatry. I just wanted to...
Yes, thank you. Yes, it's the entire people group. And God waited, and God finally said, hey, I have to judge these nations, and I'll bring Israel to judge them.
How long did the practices go on? Like,
way back that people can remember. And the Canaanites are actually descendants of Ham. And I don't know if you know the Ham story, where there's like a euphemism about what Ham did to Noah when he was drunk. So my understanding is Ham had sex or raped his dad. So that gives like a little hint of what like their line, like genealogy, and how fallen they were, like corrupt they were from the beginning. And so we can understand that it actually did start way back. And child sacrifices did happen in the nation of Moab as well, and Ammon. So it's not just Canaanites. However, God decides to choose Canaanites because of His sovereignty, that in His decision, thinking, Canaanites, I've seen you, I know you, and it's time that you face your judgment because I have waited for you. So, yeah. So just clarifying, it's not just because of child sacrifice and prostitution that God's judging them. So many more. But I'm giving those two main reasons, yeah. Okay. So then what about today? Holy war today. Like the Crusades, the Holocaust, the ISIS. How are we to apply this today? Well, Kingdom of God is not physical. We know that. Because if it was, Jesus wouldn't leave. He wouldn't leave. Because Kingdom of God isn't physical anymore. Ephesians 6:12 talks about how we are not fighting against flesh and blood. We're not fighting against the fleshly things. We are fighting something that's spiritual. And so in New Testament, it talks about how we are the heirs of Abraham through faith. So since the New Testament, out of these covenants, the New Covenant from the Old has become more of like a spiritual promises and realities. And so in the New Testament, Jesus says, blessed are those who are poor and needy. In the Old Testament, God says, I'll bless you through prosperity and wealth. But in the New Testament, God says, blessed are those who are poor and needy. So in the New Testament, things are no longer physical, although I'm not saying no longer everything is physical in the New Testament. I'm not saying that. Don't misunderstand me. I do believe God blesses materialistically and stuff. But in the New Testament, there's a lot of emphasis about the spiritual things. And the promised land is one of them, because Hebrews 4 talks about how our promised land is in heaven. And we're still waiting to have the real rest in heaven. So we realize through Hebrews 4 that Promised Land is no longer a geographical location, but it's a spiritual inheritance that we have. Any questions about that? Yes.
So the Bible talks about New Jerusalem and us being here. So
Right.
wouldn't that be like a physical promised land?
New Jerusalem?
New Jerusalem, and
Yeah.
us living and communing with God, wouldn't that be physical?
Right. So now what you're talking about is the Revelation part, and that's the part that I will let the guy who speaks about Revelation talk about it, because that itself you can talk about and debate for weeks. And because of that, Christians are split into denominations because they just couldn't agree. Like, I'm talking about these highly educated scholars who just can't agree with each other because of that, the end times, whether the Jerusalem will be the actual real Jerusalem that we have right now, or is it like symbolic, third heaven and everything. So I won't go into that, but I know for sure that Hebrew 4 did tell us about heaven, and that is our promised land, and we still wait for a rest in heaven. So whether the heaven comes down on earth, or where it's up there somewhere, we still have an inheritance in heaven. And another thing is that only God can order holy war. Nobody else can command it. And He is holy and just. We have to understand and we have to believe the fact that He is holy and just and His ways are righteous. And the fact that God is sovereign. So, because God owns everything, if He decides to wash the whole earth through flood and let only Noah and his family survive, like, sometimes we just have to say, okay, God, let it be for your glory. Like, God knows He's sovereign, He's perfect, and He's holy. And these are some of the things that we just can't like fully comprehend with the world and the society, especially with humanism being so big and a value in our world where I have the right, all of us have the right. But actually, no, we don't. God owns us. And that's why it's grace and mercy for us to live today. God can totally take you today, right? So the fact that you're breathing and living today means it's God's mercy extended for today. He has a total right to take you, because we are created by Him and He owns us. And the earth is created by Him and He owns the entire earth.
I have one more question.
Yes.
And then I'll stop because I have a minute.
Oh, no, go ahead.
So if it's about like this eternal, this like spiritual, I don't know what we're talking about. I kind of forget.
The promised land?
Yeah, the promised land, the spiritual inheritance, which I agree with. Then what? Like, you have God so loved the world that He sent His only Son. So I just think sometimes when we're so focused on this spiritual reality, that we forget that everything in itself has a spiritual element to it. So then we don't actually take care of the earth, steward the earth. Just wait for my ticket to heaven. So who cares if people are dying in Africa because I don't need to do anything because Jesus will fix all that, right? And so, like Jesus said, why would He say, on earth as it is in heaven? So there has to be value here. And so that's my only question is like, can you maybe just explain like why is there value here? Because my weariness is that we're so focused on eternity that we forget that like right now God was Jesus Himself when He was speaking was so often speaking in terms of right now, what's going on, the people who are suffering now, the poor people now, we need to help them. And so I just think sometimes there's a laziness to enter into like justice and activism even because we're so focused on we'll all be in heaven, Jesus is going to fix the whole deal, when I believe He empowered us to bring heaven here now.
Yes.
So
I believe in that too. And I believe in holistic spirituality where it's not just spirit separate, and it's part of like a cultic practice, and we call it in the New Testament the Gnosticism, where they separate the flesh and the spirit and think, oh, spirit is just good and flesh is bad, so you can do whatever with your flesh. I don't believe in that, and I think Christianity is not about that. I believe the promised land for us is two ways, like in the being I shared. One, it means spiritual, that we have a promised land eternally, so whatever goes through in this world, we have to have hope and remember that, I'm suffering in this world, but it will be only temporarily because our home is in heaven. And the second thing, Jesus brought kingdom on earth. And His idea of kingdom on earth was so strong in the message of the gospel. And I do believe that we as Christians need to bring heaven down on earth. And that means taking care of our bodies. So we need to exercise. That means we go and take care of like even the idea of recycling, because we need to take care of this earth. For God gave the earth to humanity, he says. We are called to be governors and stewards of this earth. And that's why we have a lot of references in the New Testament where Jesus used parables, and Paul used parables such as like, we are stewards, we are managers, we are soldiers, because there's still work to be done on this earth. So what I'm saying it's just about spiritual things. The promised land isn't spiritual. It is both. We have heaven, however, and that also takes on with whatever you believe in, how you are saved and whatever. But we still have responsibility to take care of our day-to-day, moment-to-moment lives, because we will be accountable at the end. Jesus will say, how did you live your life? So I totally believe we both have to believe that spiritual, we have heaven, but also physical, we need to bring kingdom on earth here. Any more questions? Did that answer you, clarify, Chris? Okay, we can talk more later, to clarify. But thank you for bringing that up, yeah. Because I'm not for, ignore the physical. No, that's so bad. That's not biblical. God, this is the temple, Jesus said. The flesh is the temple of God's Spirit. We need to take good care of it. And by no means am I saying because of Canaan had witnesses at that time, we don't need missionaries. No, we need missionaries to go out. But even in the circumstances that we think it's so impossible at that time, God still made a way so that his missionaries will go and witness in Canaan. So that's something that I wanted to highlight. Okay. 30 minutes. Now we're going to go through the actual book of the Bible, the book of Joshua. So now we talked about the background of Joshua, all this history, this scholarly debates about Joshua, but now we're going to go chapter by chapter, or parts of Joshua, and we're going to go through. And I will not have you guys here past 12, so don't worry. Okay. So the first part, preparation, and it covers from chapter 1 to 5. Okay, rising after Moses. Now, I want you to put yourself in the shoes of Joshua and kind of look at the scenario and feel how he would have felt. Deuteronomy 34, 10 to 12. Could you read it out?
Yeah, sorry. There has never been another prophet in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. The Lord sent him to perform all the miraculous signs and wonders in the land of Egypt against Pharaoh and all his servants and his entire land. With mighty power, Moses performed terrifying acts in the sight of all of Israel. Deuteronomy 34, 10 through 12.
Hannah, could you read the next part? Yes.
After the death of Moses, the Lord's servant, the Lord spoke to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' assistant. He said, Moses, my servant, is dead. Therefore, the time has come for you to lead these people, the Israelites, across the Jordan River into the land I am giving them. Joshua 1, 1, 2.
Okay. So, imagine this. This just happened. And the commentator says, there's nobody like Moses. And now Joshua is taking on that mantle. There was nobody like Moses who had performed these terrifying acts in front of Israel and also in Egypt. Everybody was scared of him. Everybody knew that he had authority. And now Joshua is supposed to rise up and take his place. I think this is really funny because before this chapter 1 in Deuteronomy, we read this commissioning ceremony of Joshua, where Moses brings Joshua up in front of Israelites and says, this is your new leader after me. And through Moses' words, God speaks to Joshua and says, be strong and courageous, for you must bring the people of Israel into the land I swore to give them. I'll be with you. So it wasn't in Joshua that Joshua first heard this phrase. He heard this actually way before in the book of Deuteronomy during his commissioning. But guess what Moses says right after? After he says this over Joshua, he goes and turns to the Israelites and says, you guys are rebellious people, and you are going to be more rebellious after I die. Now, think about this new leader, right? He had witnessed his school leader, for example, DTS context, going through such a hard time with the students. And then he's like, okay, now let's have an outreach leader for Egypt come up. And then he brings up Joshua. He's, taking his team to Egypt. And this is what he says, Joshua, don't be afraid. God will be with you. And then he turns to the crowd, to the students. You guys were rebellious in DTS, but you're going to be more rebellious when you go on outreach. Like, imagine Joshua as a leader, like, oh, great. Like, they were about to stone Moses. They didn't like him. They were about to rebel and leave him and kill him and go back to Egypt. And now I have these crowd. They're more rebellious when he dies. Like, imagine the pressure. So, if you were Joshua, what questions would you have as you're stepping up into leadership? Like, what questions would you have? Ragnall? Is it Ragnall? Yeah. If you were Joshua and rising up as a leader, I don't know, what would be like personally for you, questions that you will have?
What am I going to do?
Yeah, exactly. What am I going to do? Like, what am I going to do? Rebecca, what about you? Why me? Why me? It's more like, God, why you have to put this burden on me? What about you, David? You just follow and obey? Yeah? Okay. That's David's style. Follow and obey. And I think Joshua kind of did that. He's like, oh no, why me? But follow and obey. What about you? Michael? You don't know? Just really overwhelmed, right? It just blocks all your thoughts. It's like so overwhelming. And for me, like, if I'm in his shoes, I will like question these three things. Like, one, like, how God, like, where do I start? Another question that I will have to God, for God is, God, will I be a good leader? Like, will I be able to do this well? Like, will I be capable in this? And another question will be, God, will I be alone or will you be with me? I think those will be three basic questions that I think any leader will have as they step up into this kind of authority and position. And it's amazing of God's commitment over Joshua. Because the very first chapter, we read God's word over Joshua and his command, and he basically answers those three things, three internal questions. One, will I be a successful leader? We see from chapter 1, verse 3 to 5. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given to you. No man shall be able to stand before you, Joshua. Second question, God, like, will you be with me like you did with Moses? And right after that, he says, just as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not leave you or forsake you, Joshua. And then finally, it's like, what do I do? How do I do this? Where do I start? Be strong and courageous, for you should cause this people to inherit the land that I swore to their fathers to give them. Be careful to do according to all the law that Moses my servant commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left. The book of the law should not depart from your mouth, but you should meditate on it day and night. Isn't it amazing? Like, God answers, almost like sees the internal struggles and questions that Joshua has. And he's like, boom, 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 I got you. I answered this. And the solution that he gives, like, God, how can I lead these people? They're going to be more rebellious than in the time of Moses. But God's like, meditate. So yes, God does answer those three questions. And he continues to commit himself to helping Joshua overcome the fear. Because it was a big, huge issue. God speaks to Joshua in 8 verses in chapter 1. And out of 8 verses, 38% of those verses says, be strong and courageous. Wow, 38. Out of all the things that God said to Joshua as he became the new leader, over a third was all about be strong and be courageous, Joshua. You got this. Be strong and be courageous. Even his commissioning was about be strong and be courageous. And what's funny is that in chapter 1 later on, Joshua tells the tribes, Reuben, Gad, and the half tribe of Manasseh about an instruction that they need to carry on. And guess what? They tell Joshua, yes, we will do everything you say, only be strong and be courageous. Wow. God is so committed, isn't he? Like, he's so committed to fight, help Joshua fight through his insecurity and his fear. Not only that, we see in the book of Joshua the obvious parallels with Moses. See, Joshua, God dries up the river Jordan to bring Israel into Canaan. Same thing with Moses. God splits the Red Sea and Israelites walk on dry land. Second thing, Joshua encounters like a physical manifestation of God's presence through the commander of the Lord's army. He shows up and he tells him, Joshua, take off your sandal because this is the Holy Land. Same thing happened with Moses in the burning bush. Moses, with the physical manifestation of his presence, take off your sandal because this is the Holy Land. And so through this, not only do we see God who's saying, hey Joshua, you're the next. I called you. Get over yourself. Can't believe you have unbelief. No, he was so committed for him to overcome his unbelief. Joshua, you got this. Joshua, you can do this. Just be strong and be courageous. And you might think, oh, come on, Joshua. It's just be strong and courageous and get over with it. But the fact that the inheritance that God has promised for them isn't just a piece of land. I want to talk to you about the significance of the inheritance. In Joshua chapter 1, verse 4, he talks about from the wilderness and its Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites to the great sea towards going down of the sun shall be your territory. Now we might think, oh, the river, the land, but what it means is that the wilderness of Lebanon was known to be such a beautiful white mountain. It wasn't just like a small mountain. It was a beautiful big white mountain. And good wood came out of Lebanon. And the great river Euphrates wasn't just like an average river that you will see in your daily life. It was a river that was mentioned back in the Garden of Eden. It's one of the great rivers that flow out from the Garden of Eden. So God was saying, hey, I'm giving you this piece too. Very significant in our history. That's your inheritance. And then the Hittites, they were the kingdom that actually rivaled with Egypt. Hittites were so powerful that Egyptians and the Hittites will often try to conquer over the land of Canaan. So there's a constant rivalry between Hittites and Egyptians. And God's saying, hey, I'm going to give you this. So, of course, Joshua will be like, this is so overwhelming. So I see, like, for example, if God put you out from DBS and took you to California, shows you the city of LA, says Hollywood, and all the producers, the directors, the singers, the actors, and actresses. He also shows you the Stanford University, the headquarters of Apple, the headquarters of Google, and tells you, this is your inheritance. Go and conquer them. It's your promised land. You were equipped through DTS and DBS. You are enough. Like, you will be like, so imagine that pressure, guys. The fact that God was saying all these lists, the Euphrates River and all that, it wasn't just a little piece of river or little piece of land. God was saying, significant pieces, it's your inheritance. And of course, Joshua will be terrified. And so God was so committed to convince him and to tell him, you got this. Be strong and be courageous. And it's 11:45. And I want to stop here because the next part is what I want to talk about, meditation and how God gives this as a solution to the Israelites. So we'll stop here. But before that, any questions so far? Okay. Johnny and I will be in the cafeteria for lunch. Feel free to grab us if there are things that you're like, oh, Lia, I didn't really understand. Could you explain to me this better? Come and grab us. Love to talk with you guys. So thank you.
Thank you. So something that I want to highlight to you guys that I heard that stuck out to me as she was going over this stuff was commitment. Is if Joshua stayed committed to the Lord, then the Lord is committed to fulfill all of these wild things that he told Joshua that he would do. And so what I want to leave you guys with as we go is, where are your commitments? Just think about that. And I'm not talking about like you're committed to DBS. Like, yeah, that's one of your commitments. But I'm talking like in your life. What have you committed yourself to? Even things that you may not realize you've committed yourself to. There might be a friendship that you feel committed to because you don't want to disappoint them or something like that. And it might become something that is an unhealthy commitment. Just want you guys to think about, what are you committed to? And are your commitments higher than your commitment to Jesus? Is there a disparity between that? So that's something I wanted to leave you guys to think about. Amen? Is that okay? Actually, Leah, will you pray for the class? That kind of prayer, and then I have some announcements, but I really feel that would be really good for you to pray over them in this thought.
God, I thank you that you are grabbing everybody's hearts, that you're so committed to grab their hearts and turn their hearts towards you. And so, Lord, I ask for that grace, that it's by your grace that we can start. So I ask for your grace, and at the same time, your strength and your confidence to help us to live that out. And so if there are people here that really needs to remember the commitment, Lord, would you make it so clear to them? And I also pray that those that are already committed, that you give them the strength to persevere. Bless them in Jesus' name.
Thank you so much. I have a few announcements to go over with you guys. Are you guys okay? Yeah? So we had a few emails go back and forth between the Quarter Point team as far as ministry night tonight, because there's apparently some kind of Iron Man dinner appreciation thing for something, and whether or not ministry night was going to take place. So if you guys go to ministry night, we encourage you guys to go to ministry night. It's amazing times, but it won't be in the Ohana Court tonight. It'll be in the prayer room tonight at 6:30. So ministry night will happen. If you go to Ohana Court and you're like, oh man, nerds, it's because it's in the prayer room. I know some of you say, oh, nerds. It's okay. One of the things that I noticed as I was grading, and I heard and I saw a lot from the other staff, is that there seems to be a misunderstanding of historical background when it comes to your summary assignments. So if you have your manuals, open it up to one of the weeks, and let's take a look at your summary assignment really quickly. Because I want to be sure that we're all on the same page, because your staff are grading at a certain expectation. And I feel like some of the things that maybe there was some misunderstanding, and you guys are getting hit for points and you thought that you were doing it correctly. So I want to bring some understanding, okay? So in your summary assignment, point B, can I borrow this real quick? It says, list 3 pieces of historical background information that will change/impact the way you read Scripture, and write about why this piece of information brings change or impact. These can come from lecture, the Nelson's Bible Maps and Charts, Bible dictionaries, or other resources. Please cite your reference. So when we say historical background, that needs to come from something outside of the Bible. For your summary assignment, your historical background cannot be just a description of Moses' life, because most of those things I can find in the Bible. A good example of a historical background was this little thing that she said on what happened after somebody came in and conquered a city. They conquered a city, they covered it over, they built on top. Somebody else would come along. That is a historical fact that can impact how you read Scripture. Okay? So what we're looking for is some kind of historical something that it cannot be found in the Bible, And it's not just an interesting, like, oh, I thought this was interesting. It needs to be something that brings some sort of change or impact to how you read the Bible. So when you're doing your homework, you need to share something either from lecture. I know Debbie brought some interesting stuff on, I can't remember. But like, for example, today, or there were things that I know Nate brought about, like, the Egyptian pharaohs and everything. And it's like, that kind of stuff just blew me away. And I read Exodus differently because of this historical thing that brought a better understanding to the scripture. So in your homework, you're going to say, oh, I heard that, one of the pharaohs was talking about his son, and then all of a sudden the son wasn't talked about in history, and his second son was now the ruler, and that changes how I read and understood Exodus, because it's showing some evidence to the fact that the first son was killed by the 10 plagues. Like, you're taking a historical fact, and then you're sharing how it changed or impacted the way you read scripture. Yes, ma'am. Give me an example.
Like, for example, she told us that when they would take the women and shave their heads, like if you don't know that was the thing that actually did.
Okay, so in the text it says, shave their heads, trim their nails, and let them mourn. If you just say that happened, then that's not a historical thing. But if in lecture they said, in the culture, that meant that it was this, and it was them being separated then yes. Like, if there's something that it says something in the Bible, and then someone brings some cultural understanding, that is good, because that cultural understanding won't be in the Bible. Does that make sense? And it's important that you guys don't just write out a historical fact. You need to then include how that changes or impacts the way you read the scripture. And it needs to be more than just, this changed the way I read the Bible. Okay? There needs to be something in there that kind of explains, this changes how I read Exodus, because, it brings, you need to actually give us more than just that. Does that make sense? I'm hoping that because there were some things, and you can go to outside sources like Bible dictionaries, but you need to tell us how that's going to affect the way you're reading. Don't just give me a fact from a Bible dictionary and then move on, because all you're doing is just giving me information, and that doesn't tell me anything. The point and the idea behind that is that learning about the historical context and the culture of the time is impacting how you understand the text. Okay, so it's actually really important, and that's why we want you guys. I look around and I see some of you guys taking notes, and I look over and some of you guys are just sitting there, and I'm like, oh, you're missing stuff. So, and this is one of those things where you can go to somebody and go, hey, Avi, man, I'm really struggling. Do you have any good historical backgrounds? What did you hear this week that I may have missed? That's okay to collaborate on, as long as you're not word for word someone's homework, right? Maybe Hannah heard something that I missed, or maybe somebody picked up on something that was really neat and be like, oh man, that's great. I'm going to use that, as long as am I making sense? Anybody have any questions about that? It differs from your IBS historical background, because in your IBS, you can use historical stuff from the Bible. Like, you can say, in the Genesis 50 IBS, my historical background was the story of Joseph and how he got sold into slavery. That's fine for your IBS, because you're just bringing some better understanding to that. But for this assignment, it needs to be outside of the text. Yes? Yes. Your special assignment this week, if you've looked at your special assignment, it is a map. One of our resource materials that we have over in that box is called Nelson's Bible Maps and Charts. It might be smart to maybe pick one of those up and look around page 62 or 63. That's all I'll say on that. All Okay, that's all I have. I love you guys. Go to lunch.